the bad joke is that the Ag and Natural Resources Committee is where wildlife bills go to die. But I don't assume to understand their motivation, but I do understand what the consequences of their votes are. And the consequences of their votes are to maintain and to further climate warming, the loss of biodiversity, and the degradation of ecosystem health across Colorado.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This week, our guest is Delia Malone. Delia Malone is an ecologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, retired, volunteers as founder and president of ColoradoWild, and is vice chair of Roaring Fork Audubon. As a field ecologist for the past 30 years, she's conducted ecological assessments of upland, wetland, and stream habitats and biological surveys of rare plants and animals across Colorado, from Dinosaur National Monument to the Canyons of the Ancients and east to Purgatoire Canyon, I assume is how it's pronounced. These decades of ecological and biological analyses have informed Delia's purpose and need for protecting and restoring native wildlife and plants to Colorado's vast public wildlands. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Delia.
Thank you, Josh. I am grateful to be here and to share information with you.
Yeah, well, you've definitely been on my radar for quite some time, so I'm glad that we can directly interface here. So, yeah, let's talk about some wildlife in Colorado, and obviously these species don't just live in Colorado, but let's start with some wolves. So there was an article that I was reading, and there was also an interview with you in Colorado Green Voice, which is a pretty much the only official Colorado environmental media outlet, dedicated media outlet. I'm a part of that. And you were interviewed by our wildlife editor, and you talked a bit about wolves and forests. And so, yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your take on wolves.
What we've come to understand after 8 decades now of solid, reliable scientific research and kind of a change in an ethical view of our responsibility in the world is to recognize that wolves are essential to forest health. And when we extirpated wolves, almost eliminated them from the lower 48, what we saw and what we observed with good, solid science is the decline of forests. And of course, there's so many other critters that depend on forests, from birds to insects to snakes, amphibians, and all the way up the ecological web of life. And so when we, you know, it's an overused kind of analogy, but when we pull in on the string of anything, everything else responds. I think that's critical to understand. And wolves, especially, the term is they're a keystone species. And that simply means that they have a disproportionately large and positive influence on the ecosystem in comparison to their abundance.
Yeah, no, that's great to know. And yeah, I guess a lot of times people forget about the interconnection between how wildlife species directly shape the landscape, and of course vice versa. They're inseparable, and so that's a really interesting angle on stuff. So maybe give people a little background on why wolves are particularly relevant in Colorado.
Oh, importantly, every every inch of Colorado before we colonists extirpated them, basically eliminated them from Colorado, every inch of Colorado had wolves, and a lot of them. in the West, not just Colorado, but in the West, there were about 380,000 wolves, and we know this from mitochondrial DNA evidence. Wolves are, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from an old 1840s explorer, had the scepter of authority over even buffalo. We think of buffalo as the biggest, the most important, but wolves, in their predation on buffalo, in their predation on elk, mule deer, and the consequent moving of those species, and I would say their selective predation by removing the weak and the sick and the old, they make the herds healthier. They result in enabling more food for the healthy individuals. So as the herd gets healthier, wolves become more and more important to move them around. And when they move them around, vegetation has time to recover. It doesn't become overbrowsed. And that vegetation, of course, supplies forage for other species. So not only are there buffalo, but because wolves are moving them around and they're vegetation to recover, mule deer can live, pronghorn can survive, bighorn can survive, elk can survive. And so it's kind of an odd concept, but predation by a native keystone species actually increases biological diversity by enabling more species to survive on the vegetation that's there.
That's right. And maybe you can give an example of where that happened. The famous one was in Yellowstone, right?
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And Yellowstone, people often say to me in Colorado, yes, but Yellowstone, we're not like Yellowstone. We can't be Yellowstone. And my response always is, but we could be. My hope is that we can restore Colorado, at least on the West Slope, where we have 17 million acres of public land. We could become like Yellowstone. And that's the vision, that we could rewild. And so it's a complicated but somewhat simple story. Ecosystems have a lot of complexity. But overall, the concept is that when wolves were removed from Yellowstone by 1926, and they were removed by the federal government primarily to benefit livestock producers, and to benefit what they thought would benefit hunters, because the thinking at the time, which has proven so false, or the thinking at the time was that by removing carnivores, wild game would become abundant and that would benefit hunters. Well, that myth has been debunked for a very long time. So in Yellowstone, when they removed wolves, the elk population did just exponentially increase. And in that exponential increase, without wolves, and it wasn't just wolves that were the target of the federal eradication program, it was anything, any critter that would interfere with the livestock industry or the hunting industry. So cougars, grizzly bears, coyotes, anybody that got in their way were also eliminated. So all of the moderating effects of carnivores on large ungulates was basically eliminated. So yes, ungulate populations increased exponentially, and we had vegetation responded. And the response of the vegetation was to be decimated. And it didn't have a chance to regrow because every time any regrowth started, the elk would hammer it. So if we look at our aspen groves in Yellowstone and in Colorado, Colorado has the uh, largest cover of aspen groves of any state in the West. But what's key in aspen groves, when you look at an aspen grove, typically they're connected by an underground root system. And that's really very advantageous. So if an avalanche of the grove, those roots will produce suckers, and those suckers will reproduce and regenerate the forest. Key is that those suckers need to get to be 6 to 8 feet tall before they can become they can grow on to produce an upper canopy. If they're continually if those suckers are continually browsed down, they cannot regrow to reproduce a standing forest. And of course, one of the other little detail in there is that the new suckers are the most palatable. They have the least chemicals in them. And what plants do to protect themselves from browsing is they produce things like alcohols and terpenes that makes them very unpalatable. That doesn't really happen until they get older. So when they're young, they're very vulnerable to predation. Vegetation is predated by elk. So by keeping the elk moving around, elk can eat browse a few of the aspen suckers, as long as they don't browse all of them. But when there was no wolves around to move those elk around, there was no reason for the elk to move. So they just browsed out all of the aspen suckers. And similarly, on stream banks with willow vegetation, they did the same. And so when those stream banks and when those forests were overbrowsed, there was nothing to hold on to the soils. There was nothing to prevent the soils from eroding. The vegetation, the herbaceous vegetation, the grasses and forbs that would normally have grown there were out the forbs, flowering plants, broad-leafed flowering plants, were outcompeted because they couldn't withstand the drying soils. So those broad-leafed flowering plants, those are typically the ones that critters like mule deer like to forage on. Elk can forage on most anything. They are the generalists of the planet. And a friend of mine, Jim Halfpenny, who's kind of a world famous tracker up in Yellowstone, likes to say that elk don't eat just the cereal in the box. They can even eat the box and survive. So when the canopy of aspen was removed, when the willow cover was removed, soils started drying, and broadleaf flowering plants couldn't tolerate that. Grasses took over, and the animals that can forage on grasses, they become more dominant. Mule deer become less prevalent. That's happening in Colorado. Elk are definitely out competing. It's one of the factors that's causing the decline of mule deer in Colorado is an overabundance of elk. So what we see the streams and the stream banks start to downcut, the streams downcutting into the channel because the willows have mostly been browsed out. It's the roots of the willows that are holding on to those soils. Those soils start to erode away. The streams kind of downcut, and the stream cuts so far down into the banks that during spring flooding flows, those flows can no longer get up and out of the channel to re-wet the floodplain. So we get the entire floodplain drying. And instead of having a wetland, we have dry uplands. Some of those will never recover from that because they've gone past the tipping point. The ecosystem has actually changed. What we saw then, okay, so we got 20, 25, 26 wolves are gone. Elk are exponentially growing. The canopy of the aspen groves has been eliminated. Willows are being eliminated, and we see fundamental ecosystem change. 1995, fast forward, there's a lot of other in there. 1995, wolves are reintroduced to Yellowstone, 95, 96. And what we see in Yellowstone is that because wolves are protected in Yellowstone from human persecution, we see those wolf families thrive. And we see in a very short time, within 10 years, we see the wolf population in Yellowstone, it reaches kind of a maximum. And it's kind of oscillated around that maximum, around 100, down to 90, up to 110, 120, back and forth, oscillating in response to the elk population. What we also see is we begin to see the recovery of some of the aspen groves and some of the willow. And with that recovery of some of the willow along some streams, we see the recovery of beavers because the willow starts to come back. Beavers depend on willow. Without willow, the beavers left. They don't have anything to make their homes with. They don't have anything to forage on. We start to see the recovery of beavers. With the recovery of beavers and their dams, we start to see the water table increase, raise up. And so that during springtime flooding flows, the flows can get up and out of the channel and re-wet that floodplain. And so we start to see the recovery of wetlands and the willow and all of the critters, the amphibians, the birds, that particularly the bird community. The bird communities are really good indicators of how healthy or not ecosystems are. And so we start to see birds in Yellowstone, warblers, uh, Lincoln sparrows, song sparrows, Wilson's warblers, yellow-rumped warblers that we hadn't seen in decades as an indication that the ecosystem is actually beginning to recover after just a short 10 years. That depends critically on healthy wolf populations that are intact in family groups that can perform their ecological function of moderating elk populations. Two wolves is considered technically a family. Two wolves have great difficulty, although they can do it for sure, taking down and moderating elk populations. So key to the success in Yellowstone, and not just Yellowstone, we can look up to Isle Royale up in Lake Superior. We can look to Voyageurs National Park. We can look to Denali, where wolves aren't persecuted by humans, when their families can be intact. There they can have this amazing ecological role of restoring ecosystem health.
That's amazing. And yeah, that's the best explanation I've heard of the Yellowstone transformation. I was familiar with parts of that, but really not all of it. And it's almost as if nature is somehow connected, like the different pieces. It's amazing. Who would have thought? And that you can't just pluck something out because we humans want more of a thing or less of a thing and expect the whole system to just, it can adapt, it can limp along, it can recover and restore itself, but that's the importance of the concept of ecological integrity is just, let's have the pieces there. So that's a great reminder of what had happened in Yellowstone and could be inspiration for elsewhere. So maybe just give a summary of wolves now in Colorado. So how did they come back?
They came back because a concerted coalition of compassionate humans focused and came together with a tremendous effort to rethink and to restore, and to reconsider the cultural norm of the only good wolf is a dead wolf. And this is such an important example of what citizens can do because it was this amazing concerted effort that took years. It wasn't, we had the election to restore wills in 2020. That wasn't a 1 year or a 2 year or a 5 year. That was an effort really since beginning in the early 1990s with a small group in Colorado called Sinapu. Many of the folks that were in Sinapu, based in Boulder, are still adamantly active in the wolf restoration effort. And when we all came together, it took a lot, but we did. And we were able to go across Colorado. We talked to thousands of people, thousands of citizens to say, we need this. And that effort paid off. That effort resulted in very narrow election, a very narrow win, but we did win. And I think, we've had bumps for sure. We've had hurdles for sure, and we still do. I think our biggest hurdle still is the cultural hurdle. It's the culture that eradicated wolves in the first place. That particular mindset is still alive and well. Um, and we have to, for wolves to succeed, for cougars to succeed, for birds to recover, that mindset has to advance. It has to change. And that is really our biggest, our biggest goal, to bring a, a new ethical, science-based, those two words are important, or three words, science-based and ethical viewpoint to how we relate, to how we have a restorative relationship with the natural world. That's our goal.
Yeah, it goes really deep. And at Green Root Podcast and Eco Integrity Alliance, we do talk a lot about roots of things. And of course, we have to get bills out there. We've got to put out the science, but there is this cultural undercurrent. And yeah, I learned that the wolf issue was a culture war back when I was living in Oregon, because so there, unlike Colorado, where there is a deliberate reintroduction of wolves, in Oregon, they sort of just let them come in. I think it was from Idaho at the time. And I remember going to rural, I guess, Eastern Oregon, which is sort of basically like Western Colorado in a sense. And it's away from the population centers. And so it's a lot more conservative. And I remember testifying at something, and there were folks there who were ranchers, pretty much mostly ranchers, livestock ranchers. And I remember two comments in particular that were made. I was in there giving like scientific studies showing how domesticated dogs kill many more livestock than wolves, things like that. So I'm like, okay, well, if I put numbers out there, that's what matters. So I remember one person who was opposed to the wolves coming back saying that we needed to build 10-foot high fences around all children's playgrounds, 10 feet high and then 10 feet into the ground, to avoid children from being eaten by wolves. And then there was somebody, and this is the stupidest comment I've probably heard about anything. He called, without making a joke, this was a serious statement. He said that wolves are the child molesters of the forest. I don't even know what he was talking about. I don't even know what he meant by that, but just the histrionics and the irrationality of that is just absurdity. But so reintroduction into Colorado, how are the populations doing in Colorado?
Boy, it's an easy question to answer. Something of an easy question to answer. And I want to step back just a minute and say, I also, after several decades of thinking that if people just understood the science and if they just looked at the numbers, they would have this epiphany and say that we really do need wolves. And as a scientist, that's what I believed for a long time. And I was completely disavowed of that idea. When I really came to realize that wolves are more of a symbol of everything that the colonizers were against. And what the colonizers were for was to dominate and profit from the West. And wolves were a symbol of everything they needed to get rid of to be able to dominate and profit. And they still are. And so that symbol is a symbol of change, a symbol of a changing culture. And boy, humans don't like to change. So in Colorado, of the 25 wolves that were actively reintroduced, 10 in 2023 and another 15 in 2024. Of those wolves that were actively reintroduced, 12 survive. I think 8 were killed by humans in one way or another. And the numbers are going to not add up because one of the wolves that was killed by humans was by Colorado Parks and Wildlife for depredating, and it was a pup that was actually a juvenile that was born in that first year. 3 of the deaths are still under investigation. One of the adults of the King Mountain Pack was killed when they were replacing a battery in a GPS collar. The female of that pack, that was they had, we think, 4 pups. The female of that pack recently died, unknown causes. It's under investigation. And then so out of the 4 packs that we know we have in Colorado, um, 4 packs that had pups, um, we're thinking that there's, average of 4 pups in each of those packs. So that may be 16 new individuals. We have 12 surviving of the reintroduced. So 12 plus 16 is 28. Importantly, the genetic variability is very low. Um, I want to say something real quick too, if you don't mind. There's so much controversy about the Copper Creek wolves. And those are the wolves that had the first litter in Colorado. They came from your state of Oregon. Neither of those Copper Creek adults had any evidence of predating livestock before they were brought to Colorado. So that is a complete myth, complete misunderstanding. And what the opposition is focusing on with wolves is that CPW should not, they introduced wolves to Colorado when they were known livestock depredators. That is false. They were not. Um, the second part is that the father of that first Copper Creek family was poached. He was wounded. He was mortally wounded in the leg. It was the ultimate cause of his death. While he was wounded, he had his female and pups in the den. There was a rancher that had refused to close his carcass pit, which attracted the male. And since he was mortally wounded, the easiest way to get food was to go to that carcass pit. And then that same rancher moved his calves within 2 miles of the known denning site. So, in my opinion, the responsibility is 100% on that rancher. And yet that rancher was compensated hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the Copper Creek family story is one of tragedy that is our responsibility.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more in there. But I know that we have limited time. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I encourage folks to look more into that, but Great. I wasn't aware of all the details of that either. But yeah, the idea of, okay, if people are going to be ranching, that's going to happen personally. And at Eco Integrity Alliance, we say, okay, but you can't do that on public lands because this multiple use concept is not truly that. Your use takes precedence and dominance and it harms the other uses. But yeah, the lack of effort on the part of a lot of ranchers, and again, this isn't to demonize all ranchers, but clearly this person didn't do due diligence and the blame just always falls on the wild creatures, and they have the story of both fear, the trumping up of irrational fear, and greed. There's money to be made from it, whereas our arguments are like, well, we individually are not going to benefit from this. This is something larger than us. And I think fair compensation for a rancher if their livestock is taken, if they did the stuff they're supposed to do, which they typically don't. But I did want to segue a little bit into government stuff. But did you have anything else to say on this before we get into some of that?
Sure, just a shout out to a couple of ranchers. A fellow by the name of Glenn Elzinga up in Idaho. Um, he runs, I don't know, 500 head on public land. For the last 12 years, he's used what's called, non-lethal coexistence methods, range riders, low stress livestock handling, and so on and so forth. He's lost no livestock. No wolves have been killed. No cougars have been killed. No bears have been killed. And his livestock actually gain weight. He makes more money now than he did before. The soils in his allotments, actually, they're monitoring. They sequester more carbon now. He has more diversity in the plant community that he had before. So his methods of running cattle actually have been beneficial to both him and his grazing allotments. Another shout out to Suzanne Asher Stone, who has the Wood River Wolf Project up in Idaho. Also, about 22,000 sheep for the last, now it's 18 years, something 19 years. Sheep are a lot more vulnerable. They just are. And she loses the last 3 years, they've lost none. Prior to that, they lost an average of 4 to 5 sheep out of 22,000 or so. So non-lethal coexistence methods work, but we have to use them proactively, and we have a shared responsibility to use them appropriately.
Yeah, and that's great to mention. There are ways to do things that are more in coexistence. I guess the question is, what are the incentives for ranchers to do so? You brought up some pretty darn good incentives, but if we get into the cultural component, that seems to be what's overriding. So they'll claim it's about, oh, the economic hardship, but it's about a cultural component and, like you say, humans not wanting to change. But it's great to have these examples of ways that it can be done differently. So that's great that you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that. So in Colorado, we have an entity called Colorado Parks and Wildlife, CPW. So yeah, what's your take on that entity in general?
Well, you asked me the question at a really complicated time because today, maybe right now, but at least in an hour or two, the Senate, Colorado State Senate, is going to be voting to confirm or not three of Governor Polis's newly appointed CPW commissioners. Their their hearing in the Senate Ag Committee was on Wednesday. One of them got recommended, two of them did not. And so then they go to the full Senate for a vote. Has been, and I have huge thanks to Governor Polis for changing the makeup of the commission. So detail, there's 11 commissioners by statute. Three of those must represent the ranching industry, three the hunting industry, three recreationists, and two are at large. In other words, two are supposed to represent all of the other Coloradans. So important to note in those numbers that 94% of Coloradans neither hunt nor do they fish. So up until Governor Polis, the commission was pretty well rubber stamped because the appointees were all supportive of the culture of hunting and fishing and ranching. And there was very little representation for the so-called non-consumptive wildlife user. In other words, birders and people that just love to watch wildlife and didn't have any desire to use it, as in hunting and fishing. So has been, no doubt, a sea change with regard to the makeup of the commission, because now we actually have a couple of scientists on the commission. There's no requirement for any commissioner to have any scientific background. And I guess I need to state full disclosure, one of the Governor Polis's appointees, Dr. John Emmerich, is my partner. He's a scientist, he's an ecologist, and he has worked professor, Colorado School of Mines for 20 years, and then doing science for other organizations, Colorado Natural Heritage Program also for the last 10. And he was one of the ones that was rejected, did not get a stamp of approval from the Ag Committee. So there is, and in my opinion, an important change in the culture of, or tried to be important cultural change in the makeup of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which has, again, people don't like to change. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, historically, I got to step back and say historically, before Colorado Parks and Wildlife used to be Parks Department, and then there was Division of Wildlife, and then they were brought together as one organization. And so when it was Division of Wildlife, in my opinion, they had a more balanced approach to wildlife. A good friend of mine who just passed away, John Seidel, was the lead on the reintroduction of Canada lynx to Colorado. That was a battle. The ranchers stood outside of the Capitol and had a protest against the reintroduction of Canada lynx because they were saying that they were going to eat all the cows and eat all the sheep. But there were good biologists at the time that said, no, we need to have everyone. We need to have all the animals. We need to have all the plants to restore the connections, to restore the interactions. That seems to have gone by the wayside. That, I participated in the fur bear working group, and there were people that we were supposed to evaluate the current fur bear management plan. So the current fur bear management plan is basically not a plan at all. There are no quotas on the numbers of fur bearers. So there's quote unquote, and I don't dislike the term fur bearer because it implies that their usefulness is to us and they have no intrinsic value. So, but I will use that name because it includes 17 species for which CPW has management authority. Everything from mink to pine martens to badgers and beavers and bobcats and swift foxes and kit foxes and gray foxes and more. There are no quotas on the killing of those species. There is no data except on bobcats and swift foxes as to their actual abundance or distribution. And yet hunters and trappers are allowed to kill them, as many as they want for, I've forgotten the cost. I think it's $30 or $35 for the license. That culture is changing. Um, just recently, and there was a lot of angst about this, there was a fur bearer petition in front of Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission to end the commercial sale of those wildlife species. Didn't have anything to do with farm raised species, didn't have anything to do with the vote in Denver last year. This was having to do with the sale of wildlife species for their fur in Colorado. The commissioners voted to support that petition, and there was huge, and is huge outcry against that. And basically, the pushback from the opposition is stating that the commissioners that voted to support that petition were not basing their decision on best available science. Well, best available science is a really simple but important definition, has really important caveats. It must be independently peer reviewed. It must be evidence-based. It must be reproducible. The decision now is based on, and this was presented to the commission by the terrestrial wildlife biologist Mark Vieira, was based on anecdotal trapper surveys. That is, none of those things, and none of those characteristics, it's not reproducible. It's not evidence-based. It doesn't have independent scientific review. That is not best available scientific information. So, changing that culture at CPW is difficult, but it's occurring. Uh, it's occurring like we all don't like change. I think they don't like change either, but I do think, and I'm hugely hopeful because I have seen change. I used to go to CPW, the commission meetings, when I was going 10, 12 years ago. There may be only one or two wildlife advocates in the audience. Now, when you go to CPW commission meetings, there's 50, 60, 100 of us. And so we are beginning to have our voices heard, and we are beginning to make change.
And that's really great to hear. And yeah, the ongoing engagement and pressure, I think, is what's causing that. And hopefully awareness around the public and members of the public actually participating in what's left of participatory democracy in Colorado, which we still have a little bit. But speaking of which, I wonder if you could say a few words about Colorado State Legislature's Agriculture, Water, and Natural Resources Committee. And I'll just preface it a little bit, and folks on the podcast who have been watching every single episode, as I hope all of my audience members do, know that there were two big bills that were just killed on the same day a few weeks ago by that committee, which again, I mean, agriculture and natural resources, it's those that paradox of those two things. And the first bill was one to do with taking a tiny percentage of the annual tens of millions of dollars of logging money to put it towards home hardening grants for low income folks, elderly people, and people with disabilities who can't afford to do the things that need to be done around their home, the thing that actually protects communities. We had pretty much all of they call them the logging interests or the extractors in the state. So everyone from County Commissioner, Jefferson County Commissioner Leslie Dahlkemper, who's one of the biggest advocates for logging, and she sits on state commissions. We have Colorado Department of Natural Resources. We even had some NGOs, unfortunately, all of whom are talking all day long about the importance of protecting homes from wildfire. And then when it comes up to, well, just take a little bit of that quote wildfire mitigation money and put it towards the things that we know for a fact and everyone agrees work, and just a tiny little bit less for logging. They all came out and said, no, 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 not $1. And of course, uh, the committee, they voted 10-3 against it. And then there was another bill, and we did have Jen Callahan on the podcast to talk about this. There was a bill that would have prevented the killing of beavers on public land. Beavers, of course, have a right to exist for their own sake, but they also keep moisture and water on the landscape, and that can, in some cases, reduce fire severity. So that was also shot down 10-3. And some of the same players, some other folks came in and said, no, we have to keep killing infinite number of beavers. And the committee was like, okay, I guess that's cool then. So that was the same day. And so yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any take on that committee and maybe the Colorado State Legislature as a whole on ecological issues.
Well, yes, Josh. The bad joke is that the Ag and Natural Resources Committee is where wildlife bills go to die. Most of them do. Um, it is heavily weighted, regardless of whether they are Republicans or Democrats. I will say that not completely. There are a couple of Democrats on that committee which are champions of wildlife and wildlands and ecosystems. So a huge shout out to Senator Danielson and Senator Kitt. They are our champions. They are the champions for Colorado's sustainability. The rest, be they Democrat or Republican, are, and I don't assume to understand their motivation, but I do understand what the consequences of their votes are. And the consequences of their votes are to maintain and to further climate warming, the loss of biodiversity, and the degradation of ecosystem health across Colorado. The consequences of their vote are to exacerbate stream drying, losses of water in the Colorado River, uh, fires. You know, this nonsense purported by one of the testifiers who used to be the White River National Forest supervisor, which is where I live, that beavers don't have a big impact because there are not very many of them, completely ignores the definition of a keystone species. The very definition of a keystone species is there doesn't need to be very many of them to make a big and positive difference. And indeed, beavers do. So long as wildlife or ecosystem bills, or the rodenticide bill, for instance, the beaver bill, the logging bill, so long as they go, and I think you got to understand it. I don't, I'm not a political person. I don't understand all the machinations in this, but bills are assigned to certain committees. And as long as these wildlife bills are assigned to the Ag and Natural Resource Committee, they are going to have a bad outcome. They are going to die.
Yeah, and let me just add real quick. So Representative Tammy Story is somebody on the committee who does great work, and she introduced that bill, wasn't our bill, but the bill that we supported and testified in favor of, that would have protected homes and protected forests by shifting some of the logging. So yeah, a couple of folks on there, but then to counterbalance that, they actually have somebody who is a public lands rancher, and it's like, where do you think he's gonna vote on this? He even said during the the beaver bailed that. Well, I'm really concerned that I won't be able to blow out the beaver dam so my cows can go on public lands. And it's like, well, that's a perfect reason why you probably shouldn't be running your cows on public lands at all. But anyway, continue.
So as long as we have this culture that has an inordinate amount of power, they don't have the numbers, but they have the power. They don't have the population. They don't have the demographic population. So it's sort of like I didn't really think about this. So a keystone species has they have a small number. They have an inordinate and positive impact on ecosystems. But we sort of twisted that concept with the legislature and with the culture. There's a very small number of ranchers, a very small number of hunters, but they have an inordinately large but negative impact on our ecosystem. So I'm not certain what the terminology for that would be, but it just sort of dawned on me that it's a twist on the concept of a keystone. Um, Changing that culture, that's going to be with politics. That's going to be voting, getting our people out to vote for those folks that will stand strong and stand true, not be swayed, not be bullied into capitulating to the power brokers.
Question. Yeah. And I would argue that that is done through a strong environmental movement, a movement that educates the public, lets them know the urgency, lets them know the threats, and puts forth a positive vision around which to unite. And so, in broad strokes, I guess, what's your take on Colorado's existing conservation, environmental, however you want to frame that movement?
In some respects, I have great hope. In other respects, I'm hugely disappointed. So let me give an example. With this recent commissioner, CPW commissioner confirmation process, the NGO community, the wildlife advocacy community, came together in a way that we haven't come together to support. Gee, we had 30 or more NGOs sign on to a letter supporting John Emmerich and Chris Sitchko. That is extraordinary. We had small NGOs, we had some of the biggest NGOs sign on to that. That is hugely positive. We can do this if we all come together. We all have differences. We're never going to be in alignment on certain things, but there are these kind of overarching topics, these overarching issues, like getting commissioners that are committed to ethical science. Let's not get into the weeds on, okay, they're gonna vote on this or that, but let's understand that we know that they are ethical scientists. Let's all come together. And that's a hugely positive example of what we can do when we come together. And so at the end of the day, literally at the end of today, we will know. But we're also, I think, committed, and I see this particularly in a lot of the smaller NGOs, we are committed to coming together. We are committed to saying, okay, let's put aside our differences of whether it's dark orange or light orange and say, this is important, this is critical, and we need to work together. Um, there are, I'm disappointed in other larger groups occasionally because oftentimes their priorities, in my opinion, conflict with their environmental, what I believe should be their environmental conscience. And we have sometimes unfortunate outcomes because, I had no, I am an ecologist. I really, up until 4, 5, 6 years ago, had no, I would rather be out counting birds. I'd rather be out in the stream counting macroinvertebrates. But then I realized that those critters are the fate of those critters is being decided in Denver at the Capitol. And so I better do something. I better learn something about that. And what I found out is oftentimes not very positive, that there's there's trading. I will vote for this if you vote for, won't vote for this or you won't vote for that. And in that horse trading, wildlife typically gets the short end. And I've seen that happen time and time again.
Yes. Yeah. And I do want to talk to you about a specific example that you were personally involved with, but just to put out my take on some of this stuff. So if it gets a little controversial with what you have to say, I will say something probably even more controversial. So then that'll make it seem like yours is nothing in comparison. But no, so yeah, in Colorado, uh, those of us who work on public land stuff, particularly focusing on forests and what is increasingly this Trojan horse that many of us refer to as wildfire pretense logging anyway. So the Nature Conservancy, many of us don't really consider as a conservation group anymore. They do buy up some land and keep it from being developed, but and that's great. I consider them a working lands group, which has a right to exist. That's an opinion that I think has every right to be out there. I just don't like how they frame themselves as protecting stuff when they're actually some of the biggest advocates and folks who actually even carry out themselves public lands logging. So they're kind of folks who've just kind of written off as they have an opinion, but it's not really a conservation opinion. But what was surprising were two other groups, Conservation Colorado and Western Resource Advocates. And you don't have to comment on any of this. This is just my personal opinion. But we had found out that those three entities, we weren't surprised about the Nature Conservancy. We didn't even bother with contacting them about it, but they were supporting a bill. So they're supporting a ballot measure. So they're collecting signatures for a ballot measure that would basically get more money for more logging. So we're already seeing more logging than we have in probably a century in Colorado. Millions of acres are proposed, clear cutting, old growth logging, roadless areas, endangered species habitat, you name it, it's either happening or proposed. And we had actually come to them to ask for some help, and they kind of included us on some of their calls. And then they announced, by the way, we are supporting this ballot measure for now that would increase more of the log. And of course, it's framed as conservation. And then there's a component that goes to outdoor recreation, which is a very clever bait and switch and extremely dangerous. And they said, but we want to hear your feedback. So a couple of us did respond. They didn't really, we got one email in response. They're like, don't worry, we got the guidelines, we got the safeguards in place. It's like, well, that's interesting because you've never publicly advocated against any of this logging. So when they didn't respond, other than that one email, we decided to put together a sign-on letter. So it was myself and Rocky Smith. He's a forest management analyst here in Colorado. He's probably the most knowledgeable person on public forests here in the state. And the letter was simply not even taking a position on the ballot measure that would increase the funding for logging. Just it was asking questions of them, saying, would there be protections for the things I mentioned, old growth logging? Would there be any safeguards in place? And we got several groups to sign on. I think we got like 25 groups to sign on, some larger groups and some mid-size and smaller groups. So it was a good showing. Sent that to them, very polite, very professional, just asking these questions. No response whatsoever. And so we're figuring out how to address that ballot measures. So that was a bit disturbing. And then we also found that those same organizations, again, obviously the Nature Conservancy, but Conservation Colorado and Western Resource Advocates, the Conservation Colorado is the largest conservation group in Colorado. They testified against the bill in the state legislature that would have routed a tiny percentage of the logging money towards home hardening grants for low income folks, elderly people, and those with disability. So they basically trashed their own reputation to come out against protecting homes in favor of logging. So my theory, and I don't have proof of this, is they have to be getting funding to promote logging. So what's happening is there's less foundation funding available for a lot of, let's say, conservation efforts, but there is a fair amount of money available for this working lands concept. So that's just, they're shifting where the money is, just like a lot of the entities and agencies here in Colorado, like the open parks and open space used to be about protecting those lands. The money's drying up, but guess what money is available? Money to log. So they're like, I guess we're logging outfits now. So anyway, that's just my take on what's been going on, what I've been seeing, which has been really distressing as a very tiny environmental group. We have our state advocates, as we call them, across 9 states, are basically our state directors. And I'm the Colorado advocate. And yeah, I've been pretty bummed about that. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about your engagement and involvement with the Colorado Sierra Club.
Oh, sure. Before I launch into that, I would like to say that unequivocally, logging is not conservation. There is no excuse for logging. And from an ecological perspective, a forest is a process. And that process occurs over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And what logging does is it disturbs, stops that process of recycling and energy flow and development. So I just wrote an opposition to a logging project that's occurring near me. Um, and not only was the proposal to log this area, and I'm sure it'll go through, um, even if the proposal would have been written with good science, it wasn't written with good science. They proposed to do the botanical surveys 1 week out of the year and in 10% of the area. And that was, they were going to extrapolate that across to say that, no, there are no rare endangered species here. Um, they stopped their logging line right next to a fen and saying, we're not going to go in the fen. Fen is basically an ancient wetland, which has protections purportedly. And fens are dependent on shallow groundwater flow. And of course, when you log, you alter groundwater flow. So it's to support it. And so I just wanted to throw that little thing in there.
Yeah, thank you.
Colorado Sierra Club. So from my own personal perspective, uh, a couple of months ago, so I was the wildlife chair for the Colorado chapter for about 10 years. I was elected to the executive committee several times. And then in 2021, the Colorado chapter was suspended and by National Sierra Club. And it was suspended. They really gave very, very nebulous reasons, but we were accused of misogyny. The executive board was. At the time, out of 13 board members, and I may be one or two off, 9 of us were females. So, and we all wrote a letter stating that we disagreed. We wrote a letter to National stating we disagreed with their analysis, their tribunal. My own thinking on this, my own opinion on this is that the Sierra Club as a whole, the National Sierra Club, let me back up, say that both me and one of my colleagues, Kent Abernathy, who is the chair of the Headwaters Group, we both received a letter about 2 months ago from the attorneys at National Sierra Club forever and always revoking our membership, so that we can never become a member of Sierra Club ever again. They did, about a year ago, they spent a lot of money with some attorneys out of Washington, D.C. or something, investigating us. Um, they couldn't find anything. So they wrote us a letter saying that we've determined, because of some unsubstantiated rumors, you are revoked. You can never become members ever again. What that also, of course, does is that prevents us from ever running for any leadership position in the club. So let me say that when we got suspended, National appointed a steering committee. None of the members of that steering committee have ever held leadership positions in Colorado before. There are people on that steering committee now that wanted to be elected, but they were never elected. They were never successful. Um, that was, 5 years ago. We were supposed to hold elections, but National said, no, you're not quite ready to hold elections. So we're going to keep you suspended for another year. We're going to keep the steering committee in place. Meanwhile, Kent and I get a letter revoking our membership, saying that we can never run again. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of, in my opinion, jockeying for power. Of course, when I was removed from my leadership position, I was also taken out of what they call the Council of Club Leaders, which I was part of, and they make decisions on environmental issues and what the Sierra Club is going to focus on, what are going to be our priorities, and what are not going to be our priorities. So with me as wildlife chair, and with me on the XCOM, and with Kent on the XCOM and head of the Chairwaters group, we lobbied for wolves being a priority. Wolves are no longer a priority. They have been knocked way down the ladder. And during the suspension of the club, since we were no longer making those sorts of decisions that we would have made with regard to wolves or other wildlife issues were deprioritized to become way down the priority ladder. There's a cultural shift. There's a cultural shift away from wildlife and towards, to 100% toward, we should be focused on climate warming. It is definitely an existential threat, but not to the elimination of wildlife. And that is essentially what's been done.
Yeah. So, how did it feel to be accused of things after spending all of this time and effort and probably your own money too, engaging with Sierra Club, which has a long and storied past, even though a lot of folks have concerns with some of the weaker stances. Also, some of the nation's best advocates have been a part of Sierra Club, particularly the state chapters. I know of many folks. So you put in all this time and dedication, and your reward was, I don't know, do you feel like a witch hunt is a proper term?
Probably a completely appropriate term. Um, I could see the writing on the wall. I could see the priorities changing. I could see the battle to keep wolves as a priority, and it wasn't working. We were dissed so many times in trying to keep wolves in the legislate as a legislative priority, because as we've been talking about, the politics of this is so important, and we would become dismissed time after time. So, the writing was on the wall. We could see the change at National. We could see the consequent change at the Colorado chapter, which is just mirroring and doing whatever national tells them to do. And so that's when, basically, that's when I thought, well, you know what? I'm not going to beat my head against the wall about this too much longer. I'm going to start a different group and bring along the people and the policies that are important to making wildlife and wildlands uh, our priority and our focus. And so that's when I started Colorado Wild. And a lot of the folks that were with Sierra Club are with us.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the way forward, in my opinion, is doing a better job than a lot of these establishment entities that, for whatever reason, seem to want to be taking another path. And it is difficult because they do have the name recognition. They have crazy amount of resources. You know, the aforementioned, the Nature Conservancy has a $1.8 billion annual budget. And it's like, I mean, that's just a madness amount of money that would be great if it was spread around. But not much we can do, I think, to reform them. I do think some pressure is good. I think the concept of calling in first, talking to them privately, like we did with Conservation Colorado and Western Resource Advocates, and when they just ignore it, it's like, well, I guess we have to go public. But ultimately, it's like creating a better vehicle that can inspire people and get the job done. So it sounds like that's what you're doing. That's what we're trying to do at Eco Integrity Alliance, and so that's really awesome. And there's this new effort called New Direction for Public Lands that's trying to bring together all of those folks who are doing that different way of doing things. Basically, what some are framing as like the grassroots version of Big Green. So we're uniting a bunch of elements to have a larger power rather than just these big monolithic status quo entities that end up seemingly not being able to fulfill their mission. But so I'm really psyched that you're pushing forward this. You're such an important voice here in Colorado and West Wide and nationally on wildlife issues. And I know you work beyond that, also on wildlands and all that. So just want to thank you for that. But yeah, before I get into the final question of the podcast, do you have anything else you want to communicate to our millions of listeners?
Yeah, so, the whole concept of grassroots and the grassroot, that's what attracted me to Sierra Club in the first place, that every single individual can be so important and is so important. That's so powerful. And that is what Colorado Wild, that sort of vision is what we have. And I love that that is the same sort of vision you have. And that is what I think will change the culture. Unfortunately, Sierra Club culture is going the other direction. And I think that is much to their diminishment. So the grassroots, we can do this. That's what I believe.
I agree. I definitely agree. So thanks for that. And so, yeah, the final question I like to ask guests is what do you feel like might be a root cause of the eco crisis, or at least a part of the eco crisis?
A root cause. Boy, that's a big question, Josh.
That's why it's just a one of
What
rather
is one
than
of many?
the.
I think one of the root causes is our separation from our world. Why am I saying that? Because I've seen what happens. I used to teach some college classes, conservation biology and ecology. And one day out of the week, we would spend an entire day outside, whatever the topic was it whether it be stream health or um, forest health or whatever it was. And at the end of the day, the transformation of those folks was extraordinary. The reconnection and the sudden vision of they really were connected, and they were all connected. And when we disconnect ourselves, when we don't restore those connections, I think we forget just how important every single little plant and critter is to the whole. And that sounds like really simple to get out and immerse yourself in the forest, not on a speed bike, but just sitting quietly to listening to the ruby-crowned kinglets that have just made their 1,000-mile journey back to Colorado, and appreciate the intelligence of the wild world. Unless you're out in it, to think about that little broad-tailed hummingbird that just arrived at my feeder 3 days ago, just flew in 2,000 miles, oh my goodness, over the desert. How in the world can that little critter, that little couple of gram, fluff of feather, make it all that way? What an amazing evolved intelligence. That, I hope, I think, I've seen, brings back the realization that every single bit of life is critical. And with that understanding, the understanding the fragility and the necessity for us to protect that life.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much for coming on the Green Root podcast and for all your work.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for everything you do to protect and conserve and restore. And I love your focus on the idea that all of us can make an important difference.
Sure. Great. Thank you.